Now this is a very long-winded explanation of a topic called Excite Delirium. Now it is very interesting, and if you are an instructor or someone who participates in training in self-protection or combatives, this can be quite a interesting subject. So please bear with me and listen all the way to the end, and I hope it'll be good for you, give you a bit more knowledge. It might be that none of you have ever heard of it before, so this will help. Obviously I'm not going to go right in depth about it, but I'm going to touch on the most important parts of it. But first of all, I want to tell a little story. Now, if any of you are old as me, you'd have heard of a guy called Max Bygraves. He always used to start a story with, "I want to tell you a story." But I'm not Max Bygraves, so let's crack on. So this story is about a police officer. So I want you to picture the scene. It's a night shift in an unusually quiet Sunday evening. Now, what I mean by unusually quiet Sunday evening, it's usually a really busy police station. Now, the officer that I'm talking about is on a night shift with his colleague, and they both work in the front desk. Now, the evening's going quite well, and it seems like the usual Sunday night. There are people coming in to collect family or friends who have probably been in custody, and there's others probably coming in to report crimes or to give statements, things like that. So it's about 11 o'clock, 11 PM on the night, when a homeless guy walks in. He's a familiar face, and what he's doing, he's just looking for a place to keep warm and to chat. Now, it's 11 PM at night, and it's pretty quiet, so the officer tells him to sit quietly in the corner and tells him that if it gets busy, obviously he's going to have to leave, which he agrees to. Now, the officer sometimes lets the odd homeless guy in if it's really quiet, to have a little warm. Just depends on what they're like. Now, it's around 1 AM now. A guy walks in crying and looking really agitated. He's shaking and he's sweating profusely. The officer says to him, "Can I help you, sir?" With that, the guy turns around and walks off laughing. Half an hour later, the same guy returns, still crying. Again, the officer asks, "Can I help you, sir?" After quite a few times, this is coming and going, and on this particular occasion, this guy replies, "If I had a gun and I pull it out, no one would see, would they?" Now, at that time, the station didn't have cameras in the front office, and the matter had obviously been raised on a few occasions prior to the event. But the officer says to this guy, "No, not really, but I'm here to offer help to you. No matter what it is, I can try and help you." Again, the guy walks away laughing. So the front office had once again gone quiet until approximately 2 hours later. So we're talking about 3 AM now in the morning, when this same guy walks into the police station. This time he gets on his knees and he begins to pray. 1 minute he's crying, the next he's laughing, which was changing from 1 minute to the next. He was still sweating and not listening to anything or anyone, and seemed to be in a manic type state. Now, the homeless guy that the officer had let in to keep warm says to the guy, "Talk to the officer, he'll help you." Now, obviously the officer's still saying himself, you know, "Can I help you?" But this guy's still on his knees and he's praying, and it seems as though he doesn't realise people are talking to him. Suddenly the guy gets up off his knees and pulls out what the officer believed to be a gun and points it to the officer's head. Now, I'm not going to get into the part of practicing gun defence and all that, but this officer had worked and been trained in certain things throughout his life, studying martial arts and self-protection. But when it actually happened, the officer sort of froze momentarily. So the officer stepped back, and his colleague, hits the emergency shutter button, and they're supposed to come down pretty quick, but this come down creeping like this. Blah, blah, blah. So this time the guy jumps over the counter and he disappears into the police station. Meanwhile, the officer's colleague hides under the desk, as obviously this man is running to the police station. He's potentially armed with a firearm. Now obviously he's left the officer on his own. So like I said, the guy disappears into the station. So the officer immediately calls for assistance via the front radio up to the RAD, which stands for Radio Allocated Dispatcher, or is commonly known as the controller. The controller tells the officer that no one's available in the station, that they're all out on jobs, but the firearms team have been called and they will be responding pretty soon. And meanwhile, the officer goes on search for the man, and after about half an hour of searching, finally finds him in the basement of the police station. Now, picture this: the basement of the police station has a function room with its own bar, and it's used for functions mainly. It is open every evening for officers that used to go down, finish work and have a drink. Not getting into that, but that's what it was there for. Anyway, the officer finally finds the guy down in the basement. So the officer approaches the man, obviously with extreme caution. At the same time, he's trying to calm the man down, but he just ignores the fact that the officer is even there and is oblivious to what's happening around him. Excuse me. The man's just standing there shouting to an imaginary person. He's soaking with sweat. Now the officer approaches him on his own. Obviously he's waiting for backup, and the officer obviously thinks there's people behind that door in this social event. So the officer obviously felt it was his duty to make sure the other people were safe. But now all means of communicating with this guy had failed, and so the officer approached looking for visible signs of a weapon. The officer took his arm and the man just throws him off like a rag doll. The officer tries again, but again the guy throws him off, and this keeps on happening quite a while. So this time the officer walks up, sticking his knee in the back of the guy's knee and dragging him down to the floor, and he starts to wrestle with him. Now this guy has amazing strength, and he starts to fight the officer off. The officer can't control this guy, and the officer's starting to panic now, and he's giving all he can give, but nothing seems to be holding this guy down. Now luckily enough, at this point the firearms team turn up and take over the situation and help the officer. Now there were approximately 10 officers at the time trying to control this guy. After quite a bit of a struggle, the guy's finally restrained, and the officers carry the guy up to the custody suite where he's detained. Now obviously when he was searched, they found a firearm, but it was an imitation firearm. Obviously the officer at the time wouldn't have known that. Doesn't matter at that time. To the officer it seemed to be real. Now obviously the duty doctor was called, and it turned out that this guy was suffering from a thing called excited delirium after taking cannabis mixed with crack cocaine. Later on, the parents of this guy turn up at the front desk, and they explain how their son was a really nice bloke. He enjoyed a smoke and never had any problems before. They couldn't understand it. Later on, it turned out that his friends thought it would be a real funny joke to mix crack cocaine with his marijuana, and obviously he never knew this, and it caused him to suffer excited delirium and resulted in him being arrested. Now that story is true, and that the officer in question was myself. So coming across someone with excited delirium is a very scary experience. And no matter what you know, or what you think you know, it won't help. You've got to approach it in a different way. So what self-defense instructors should know, this is important. On many occasions throughout my career, I've had to deal with individuals who are suffering from excited delirium. It can be quite scary if you don't know what you're looking for, especially if you just go in with all guns blazing, thinking that you're just dealing with another aggressive individual. People suffering with excited delirium are completely different, and whatever physical skills that you think you may have won't get you very far at all. Now, I think the only concept I'd ever used against someone suffering with excited delirium, and I'm by no means trying to plug my own thing, it was the shredder, otherwise known as Senshido's 5 principles of physical retaliation. Now, those of you who know me know that I teach this in the UK, but I've renamed it the pacifier because I've adjusted it somewhat to work within the UK law and mainly for physical security personnel and police and prison officers, things like that. So if I'm going to explain them what it's like to come across or fight or try and restrain somebody like this, it's like, the only thing I can describe it as, it's like fighting a bloody robot, the Terminator or something like that. Now, don't get me mistaken by thinking I'm talking about someone who's taken drugs like heroin, although I know that people who are like this can have a lot of strength, more strength than you're maybe used to, but this is a completely different thing. Excited delirium is an acute behavioural disorder, and it's got a range of symptoms. It's been linked to long-term drug use and mental illness. Now, it's often attributed to deaths with positional asphyxia, or sometimes you might hear it saying death in custody. The need for understanding excited delirium isn't just for professionals such as police officers, prison officers, medical staff or security, but it's also for self-protection instructors and combative instructors and their students, obviously. Now, understanding the signs can help prevent a potentially dangerous situation. There's certain features associated with excited delirium that can be exhibited during the use of force encounters or a self-defense situation, such as pain tolerance, constant and near constant activity, not responsive to public presence, police presence. They have superhuman strength, showing signs of rapid breathing. They don't fatigue. They may be naked or inappropriately clothed. They'll have elevated body temperature, such as, like I mentioned earlier, with that guy sweating a lot. They'll have an attraction to glass, and they might be destroying glass, things like that, shop windows, car windows. They'll show violent and bizarre behaviour, show signs of delirium, agitation, disorientation, anxiety, hallucinations, and even speech disturbances. Now, if by any chance you happen to get caught up in a violent encounter with someone suffering from excited delirium, you're going to find that the person experiencing the episode of excited delirium won't feel the exhaustion from fighting like any other person does, and they'll fight with everything they've got and even more. Like I say, it's frightening. So you've got to be prepared for a long process that can ultimately either get yourself or the person suffering the episode of excited delirium killed. That's how bad it can be. Now, in these circumstances, the person attempting to defend themselves might respond with extra strength or manpower. So, like, you know, if you're a police officer or a prison officer, that's what I mean by extra manpower. But this can actually end in an individual being restrained in such a way that it restricts their oxygen intake, and together with sudden exhaustion, it can lead to death. Again, positional asphyxia. Now, the risk of unknown medical issues, together with the escalation and the use of force, can cause multiple complications and even death, like I mentioned earlier. So what can we do to help alleviate this problem, or what can anybody do to alleviate the problem? Lacking the necessary knowledge to identify probable cases of excited delirium, you could be at a complete disadvantage in terms of safety for yourself, the individual, or the general public. So it's really in the best interest of yourself and the general public's safety to provide training to ensure positive outcomes in cases of, let's say, ever encountering someone who's got excited delirium. You may never ever engage in somebody who's got excited delirium, but if you work within a public facing job, the chances are you're going to, obviously where you face potential violent confrontations, obviously. So training should include things like mental health issues, crisis intervention, de-escalation, first aid, CPR, and most importantly the use of force. There might be not too much you can do to fully mitigate the risk of excited delirium, but you might well be confronted by someone with excited delirium, like I said before, and knowing what to look for can help. Now, there was a mnemonic put together for recognising symptoms, and the mnemonic is "not a crime." Now, this was created by a physician called Michael Curtis, I think it was. Michael Curtis. So N stands for naked. The patient's naked, sweating from hypothermia. Now, remember, hypothermia is the opposite of hypothermia. So I'm talking about someone with an elevated body temperature of over 40 degrees Celsius. Now we have O, which stands for objects. So the patient exhibits violence against objects, like I said before, such as glass. T is for tough. The patient is tough and unstoppable, with superhuman strength and especially insensitivity to pain. A is for acute, so the onset is acute. Some people might say that that person just snapped. C is for confused. Now that I'm talking about regarding time, place and purposes and perception. R stands for resistant, so the patient is resistant and won't follow commands. I is for incoherent, so the person's speech is incoherent, such as loud shouting and bizarre content. M is for mental health, so the patient exhibits mental health conditions or they might make you feel uncomfortable. And last of all, E stands for emergency, so you should request early backup and rapid transport to the hospital. Now, as with all violent situations, someone faced with someone in a state of excited delirium should try to de-escalate the situation by using verbal calming techniques. Now, due to the nature of acute behavioural disorder, a person's reaction to de-escalation techniques may be really unpredictable, and so restraint could be needed. Now, this should be kept to a minimum, and obviously using a level of force that is justifiable, reasonable and proportionate to the individual case or event. Now, if restraint is needed, keeping the person in a prone position should be avoided at all costs. Now, and they should also be constantly monitored. Excited delirium is actually classed as a medical emergency, so the first line should be realising the difference between a violent outburst and someone suffering from excited delirium. Now, if it's thought that someone is suffering from acute behavioural disorder, excited delirium, medical help should be sought out straight away so that they can be helped. So we now know that it's extreme mental and physiological excitement, characterised by extreme agitation, hypothermia, hostility, exceptional strength and endurance without fatigue. We know that because we've just explained that. So the causes of excited delirium can actually be from a number of factors, such as substance abuse, mental illness. It can actually be a combination of both substance abuse and mental illness. So let's look at the substance abuse. They could have an unpredictable reaction to either cocaine, methamphetamines, PCP, or sometimes it could be from a discontinuation of things like antidepressant medication. Then we have the mental illness side. Now, that person suffering from excited delirium might have a history of depression, schizophrenia, or bipolar disease, or even the history of another psychotic disorder or background. So, I've touched on a few signs and symptoms of excited delirium, so forgive me if I go over them again, but go like this. So we have hypothermia, such as overheating. They could be foaming at the mouth, drooling. They'll show that they've got dilated pupils. They'll show unbelievable strength. They will be impervious to pain, show signs of aggression, hyperactivity, elevated pulse rate, extreme paranoia, incoherent shouting or noises, bizarre and violent behaviour. They may be removing items of clothing or inappropriately clothed, and able to offer effective resistance to pain, and again fight for extended amounts of time. So the complications of all these are hypothermia, so high temperature, blood acidosis, electrolyte imbalances. They can have a breakdown of muscle cells that leading to heart arrhythmia, and they can be susceptible to ventricular fibrillation, and it can also cause death. The aggravating factors are ineffective respirations caused by extended prone restraint, such as positional asphyxia, extended violent resistance, and delayed emergency life support. So the recommendations, this is through the medical professions, recommend emergency response if possible when excited delirium is recognised, extra training for all people who face people or possible people suffering from excited delirium, delay struggle restraint process until enough personnel are on hand to perform rapidly and safely, immediate emergency support upon restraint, use of force options such as pain compliance might be ineffective, training in control holds, impact weapons may not be effective, should I say. Now obviously you've got to remember the use of force in your country. Tasers. Now tasers in pain compliance mode are ineffective. They won't work. There should be people should be taught about restraint positions, taught about avoiding extended time in the prone position, taught how to put the subject on his side. You should monitor vital signs, transportation to the hospital by ambulance as immediately or as quick as you can. And I think they recommend that if you're a police officer or security officer, you should accompany the ambulance. So the conclusion to this is, we now know that this is a life-threatening medical emergency which often presents itself as a law enforcement problem, but can possibly happen within a self-defense situation. Affecting physical control might be dangerous and difficult, and despite all possible precautions, death can actually still occur as a result of excited delirium. So if you are teaching self-protection, you're teaching combatives, you're a police officer, a prison officer, a security officer, whatever it is, you should know about this. Now, instructors, I would recommend, if you're a self-protection instructor or combative instructor, I'd recommend that you look more into this subject. The more you delve into it, the more fascinating it can be. and you have, or you may have, a chance where you come across somebody suffering from this, and knowing the difference between someone suffering from excited delirium or against someone who's just showing violent outbursts may potentially save you from causing death to that individual, and ultimately your own demise as well, you know. So look into a bit more, and I hope you enjoyed that. Sorry it was a little bit long-winded, but I hope you enjoyed it. Speak soon.